Colleagues, if you don't mind, I'm going to sit down because I've got a couple of notes that I just want to read from while I'm talking to you. So, for many of you who are engineers, when you talk about policy and regulation and laws and things like that, it's probably the most boring thing you can listen to. And I know that many of you want to fall asleep now or watch some TikTok, but yeah, give me 5 minutes of your time and hopefully I'll convince you why this is and regulation is important. The bottom line is it affects every single thing that you do on a daily basis. So your life is really governed by policy and regulation, whether it's just the rules around whether you want to or don't want to, don't hit that guy next to you over the head because he said something stupid on the stage, or whether it governs the way that we deploy infrastructure, the way we work together, competition matters, etc. So policy and regulation plays an incredibly and critically important role in our everyday lives. But it's more important, it's going to become increasingly important as we accelerate the deployment of fiber optic infrastructure and broadband infrastructure, the build out of towers, and more recently we've seen this tremendous boom in the data center market as well. As an industry association, we track those three areas. We really look at the deployment of fiber. We look at how fast we are deploying fiber. In many instances, we count homes passed. The second thing that we then measure is the adoption of those services. How many people are taking the service? Because that tells us a little bit about the maturity of the market and how fast the economies are growing. And then we also look at towers. So we measure tower build-outs annually, which companies are building. We look at mergers and acquisition in this space, which is currently quite a big thing. We're seeing a lot of divesting in that space. And then lastly, we also measure the data center market. We look at new entrants, who the players are, where they're investing, which countries are getting the lion's share, etc. I've got a couple of slides I just want to look at while I talk to you. And it's really just, firstly, I want to just talk about the ecosystem of digital connectivity. And of course, we all know pretty much, I haven't got a clicker. There we go. Thanks, Madame. Of course, we all know this, what the market looks like and what the ecosystem stack looks like. I think I've gone one too far. Oh, okay. So a lot of what's driving the adoption of digital services, of course, as we know, are things like some of the applications that are coming out. And sorry, I just want to see if I can move these slides. Some of the applications that are coming out, and some of the, adoption, like who 2 years ago even knew about DALL-E, ChatGPT. Right now, this is running our lives. So, there's tremendous adoption in these services. The other day, my team and I were busy compiling a newsletter, and we had like a whole bunch of statistics, and all of us were busy, and we were like, why don't we just check how ChatGPT writes this? And suffice to say, we were all like, we will never share this because we're going to be out of jobs if everybody knows how easy it was to produce this. So, a lot of these applications, the metaverse, a lot of these conversations are taking place at the moment, driving adoption. We're seeing a tremendous a market moving towards watching what they want, when they want, Netflix, and we're seeing some of the incumbents that traditionally provided satellite services really nervous, scrambling, trying to find alternative ways of delivering the same technologies, like reinventing their streaming services, etc. But I fear that the ship has sailed, and it's a little bit about the old DVD stores that are now redundant because they just wouldn't listen. So a lot of the services being adopted. Of course, connectivity is slowly growing, but the sad news is that our research shows that we are not keeping pace with international trends. And that's really sad. And although I am an African, I'm proudly African, I love my continent and I love my people, sometimes we have to measure ourselves and our progress against something. So we cannot say how good or bad we are unless there's a measuring line. So for the sake of this, I'm the first person to say we have to have African solutions for African problems, but for the sake of this, I'm going to use a couple of examples. More recently, some of you may know that the US introduced a $74 billion US fund to connect every American in the US. That's it. That's a total number. I've just had the privilege of last week spending the week with the Fiber Broadband Association, an organization that's helping, doing a tremendous amount of work in this regard. And I can tell you that, they are taking our skill because suddenly there's this boom, there's money, and they need our people because somebody's got to build out these networks. So for us, it's a double whammy. Not only are we getting left behind, we've also got a bit of a brain drain that's taking place. And these are the things that we need to guard against. So even if we can come up with funding, of course, we've got to fight, this brain drain that is facing our continent. I'm not going to read through all of these slides. It's really just about inequality and the digital divide. I want to focus quickly on the next slide, and I want to tell you why it's important that we come up with a policy direction. And so on this slide, this is a global digital infrastructure snapshot. So I want us to just focus for a second. Let's use, for instance, data centers. So you'll see at the top of the slide there, it shows that there's 4,923 co-location data centers globally. I want to show you the next slide in the same place. Just keep your eyes. And that's the number for Sub-Saharan Africa. Those are concerning numbers. Of course, if we want to compete globally, we've got to create an environment where, we build out and start building at the same pace. I want to come back. Let's look at something like IoT devices. So if you look at towards the bottom, middle left, IoT devices. Globally, the amount of devices that's available. And we literally dropped from billions to millions in Africa. Now, although this is concerning, it's also the opportunity. So we have to just find and put policy measurements in place that encourage us to invest in these areas. We can go on and on and on these slides, and we can continuously look at, how far behind we are, or how many investment opportunities there really are in this. So all of these slides will be available, and we can use it to, and it'll be distributed to us a little bit later. So what is really needed? Events like this helps, absolutely. But what I have found in my engagement across the continent is that there's limited trust between government and private sector. On the one side, private sector often blames government for holding it back, for stifling investment, for not putting the right policies in place. And government, on the other hand, often says that private sector is only financially driven, that they don't really care, that they are there to just fill their pockets and to make a lot of money. And events like this go a long way towards helping us breach those divides and to take down the walls between the parties. But a lot more needs to be done. I think that there's a lot to be said for coming together, for private sector to indicate the if this, then what policy that we often talk about. And it's going to become increasingly important. If we move forward, and we just look a little bit at, sorry, I'm struggling to see the slides, at international connectivity. There's currently 71 cable systems connected to Africa, and these are either constructed or active. So there's been a lot said about the Equiano cable, the To Africa cable. We saw one being launched in South Africa more recently, and in a single cable, submarine cable that landed in South Africa, it was the in one cable combined capacity of the 5 cables that landed before in a single cable. So, of course, it's important. We need new cables, but we also think that some of these new cables that's landing are going to push some of the older cables into early retirement. And that, of course, could have financial implications for some of the submarine cables. And therein lies the opportunity for new and building out of new cables. Just from a fiber, there's a lot of writing here, so we don't have time. Madame will kill me if we go through this. But just from a fiber connectivity point of view, I just wanted to quickly focus on 1 or 2 more slides. If we look at the fiber build-outs, we can see that South Africa is still clearly the winner. I just want to make this very clear that when South Africa started building out fiber to the home, it actually wasn't the leader. Kenya was the first country in Africa to first build out fiber to the home through their organizations. And then, of course, we know that we've got great ambitions in Zanzibar to connect the population. And Mauritius Telecom is, Mauritius, through the service of Mauritius Telecom, is actually the 3rd most connected country globally. So it's an African country. It sits on all the international and the global statistics as one of the countries in Africa that is very well connected. And that is because government made an intervention. They've got 97% penetration, and although they sit slightly lower on this graph, it's only because households were measured and not the percentage connectivity. So they've achieved 97% connectivity, and that's a showcase of what can happen if government comes together and government says, let's work together. So I think I'm going to conclude with that because I know that we're short for time. There's a lot of policy directions and instruments that can be followed. There's a lot of things that we lobby for as an industry association, for funding mechanisms to help mobile network operators deploy into underserviced areas to take some of the risk. We've seen that not just in the US, there's other mechanisms. And we appreciate that we are cash constrained, but there are ways through PPPs that we can achieve it, where there's some sort of offtake agreements that would be helpful. In globally, real estate investment trusts within the telco environment is a really big conversation. Those are some of the things that we can adopt and that we can deploy here. In fact, the biggest REITs in some parts of the world are not real estate companies, it's telco companies. So that's mechanisms that can help us to deploy infrastructure. But I look forward to spending another day or so with you. Thank you for staying awake, and I believe that there's some coffee.
Yes, and some questions maybe from the audience. Any questions? We can squeeze in a couple of questions before we go for coffee. I've got a quick one for you otherwise. You mentioned Mauritius and Kenya as some examples of best practices, pioneers and so on. Are there any other countries which stick out in your mind in terms of regulation, infrastructure rollout?
So I must just be honest with you, Madan, when we talk about regulation, I think one of the concerns that we've got as African countries, and it's something that we're seeing in the rest of the world, is that there seems to be a slowdown in the development of hardcore policies. And internationally, we're seeing a move towards more frameworks, code of conducts. I think there's greater concern from international bodies around where the tech sector is going to go. I don't think anybody could foresee what COVID had done to the world and the adoption of digitalization in the last couple of years. So those are some of the things, is to rather manage through code of conducts, to leave the policy environment in a space where there's a little bit more maneuverability. And the big concern is like when you've got to undo policy and regulation, hardcore regulation, it can take 3 to 5 years to get that done. So within which 3-5 years you can stifle innovation and an entire digital economy. So I think those are some of the trends that we're seeing globally. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Juanita. We take a break for coffee now. If we break for 20 minutes, we'll be back on track. So please do enjoy your coffee. I'm sure some of you have questions for Juanita. Please catch up over the coffee break. But first, a big round of applause, please, for Juanita Clark, CEO of the Digital Council Africa. Thank you. Thanks, Juanita. And your slides will be available for